I was staring at the rejection letter from the VA when the walls of my cabin started shaking, and I knew right then that my life in Summit County, Colorado, was about to get a hell of a lot more complicated. The letter had arrived 3 days ago, stamped with official seals and cold bureaucratic language that basically told me I could go screw myself. My claim for housing assistance had been denied again, this time because apparently my cabin did not meet the technical definition of a primary residence, according to some obscure regulation buried in subsection 12 of Form 21526, EZ. I had served 2 tours in Afghanistan, taken shrapnel in my left leg, and spent 18 months learning how to walk again, but none of that mattered to the faceless pencil pushers in Washington. The cabin shook again, harder this time, and I heard the groan of stressed timber. Snow had been falling for 6 days straight, the worst blizzard to hit the Colorado Rockies in 40 years according to the news. My roof was buried under 8 feet of it, maybe more. The weight was incredible, pressing down on the 100-year-old structure like God's own hand trying to crush me flat. I grabbed my cane and hobbled toward the door, but I was not fast enough. The northern corner of the roof gave way with a sound like a gunshot, and suddenly half my living room was open to the screaming white sky. Snow cascaded in, along with broken beams and shattered shingles. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in seconds. "Son of a bitch," I muttered, watching my breath fog in the suddenly Arctic air. I grabbed my emergency pack, the one I always kept ready out of old military habits, and made for the door. The cabin groaned again, threatening total collapse. My bad leg screamed at me as I pushed through the snow that had already accumulated inside, but I had been through worse pain. The door stuck, swollen with moisture and blocked by drift, but I shouldered it open and stumbled out into the blizzard. The wind hit me like a physical blow, driving snow into my face hard enough to sting. I could barely see 10 feet in front of me. My truck was somewhere to the left, buried under a white mountain. The road down to Breckenridge was completely impassable, had been for 3 days. I was alone up here, 5 miles from the nearest neighbor. Behind me, the cabin made one final, terrible sound, and then the rest of the roof came down. Just like that, I was homeless. I managed to reach my truck and dig out enough snow to get inside. The engine turned over, thank God, and I blasted the heat. My fingers were already numb. I sat there shivering, watching through the frosted windshield as my home of 7 years collapsed completely, walls buckling inward, everything I owned disappearing under tons of snow and debris. The VA letter was still in my coat pocket. I pulled it out and read it again, even though I had memorized every word. Denied. Insufficient documentation. Does not meet criteria. Appeal within 60 days. I had built that cabin myself after I got out of Walter Reed, using my discharge pay and what little I had saved. It was supposed to be my refuge, my place to heal away from the noise and chaos of the world. The property was part of a small development called Pine Ridge Estates, though calling it estates was generous. There were maybe 20 cabins scattered across the mountainside, most of them vacation homes for rich folks from Denver who came up a few weekends a year. When I bought in, there was no homeowner association. That changed 2 years ago when a woman named Patricia Thornwell bought 3 of the properties and decided the area needed proper management. She got herself elected president of the newly formed Pine Ridge HOA, and my life had been a bureaucratic nightmare ever since. The blizzard finally started to ease up around nightfall. I had been sitting in my truck for hours, running the engine in intervals to conserve gas. My phone had no signal, which was normal up here in bad weather. I needed to get down the mountain, find shelter, figure out my next move. The road was impossible, though. I tried to drive down and made it maybe 50 yards before getting completely stuck. Even with four-wheel drive, the snow was too deep, the drifts too high. I would need a plow to get through, and given the state of emergency, it might be days before the county got up here. I spent that night in the truck, cold and miserable, rationing the gas, watching the stars come out as the storm finally cleared. My leg throbbed constantly, a deep ache that cold weather always made worse. I had pills for it, but they were in the cabin, buried under the rubble. By morning, I had a plan. It was not a great plan, but it was what I had. 10 miles down the mountain, accessed by a fire road that branched off the main highway, there was an old National Guard depot. I knew about it because I had done some part-time work there 3 years ago, helping them inventory equipment before a funding audit. The place was mostly abandoned now, used for storage of obsolete vehicles and equipment that nobody wanted to deal with. But I remembered what was stored there, and I knew the lock code, assuming they had not changed it. It took me 6 hours to hike down. The fire road was buried but passable on foot if you did not mind post-holing through waist-deep snow every few steps. My leg was on fire by the time I reached the chain-link fence surrounding the depot. The lock was frozen solid, but the code I remembered still worked. I forced the gate open and limped inside. The depot was exactly as I remembered it. 3 large Quonset huts and a concrete pad where various pieces of equipment sat under tarps and snow. I found what I was looking for in the second hut. A D7 bulldozer that the guard had used for training exercises back when they actually did training up here. It was old, probably from the 90s, but it looked maintained. The key was not in it, but I had learned a few things in the Army. It took me 20 minutes with some wire and determination, but I got the engine to turn over. Black smoke belched from the exhaust, and the whole machine shuddered like it was angry at being woken up, but it ran. I sat in the operator's seat, getting a feel for the controls. I was not supposed to be doing this. This was government property, even if it was forgotten government property. But I was out of options. I needed to get back up the mountain to salvage what I could from my cabin, and I needed to clear that road. The county was not going to do it anytime soon, and I had nowhere else to go. The bulldozer handled the snow like it was nothing. I rumbled out of the depot and onto the fire road, blade down, pushing through drifts that would have swallowed my truck. It was slow going, maybe 5 miles per hour, but I was moving. The machine was loud and crude, and everything hurt from the vibration and the cold, but I felt more in control than I had since that first roof beam snapped. It took me most of the day to push my way back up to the main road and then up toward Pine Ridge Estates. The blizzard had transformed the landscape into something alien. Trees were buried to their midpoints. The road was completely invisible, just a flat white corridor between snow walls. I navigated by memory and the occasional landmark. I reached my property around 4 in the afternoon. The cabin was a total loss, just a pile of broken timber and twisted metal under a blanket of white. I sat there in the bulldozer, staring at it, feeling something heavy settle in my chest. Everything I owned, gone. The VA letter might as well have been a death sentence. Without housing assistance, without my home, I was looking at sleeping in my truck or finding some flea-bag motel I could not afford. My disability check covered basic expenses with nothing left over. I had no family, no safety net. I climbed down from the bulldozer and waded through the snow to the ruins. The cold was brutal, but the sky was clear, and the sun was bright enough to hurt. I started digging, looking for anything salvageable. My hands found photo albums, ruined but maybe recoverable. Some clothes, frozen solid. The metal box where I kept my service records and important documents. Thank God. I was so focused on digging that I did not hear the vehicle approach until it was almost on top of me. I looked up to see a black Escalade pushing through the snow I had just cleared, pulling up beside my buried truck. The driver's door opened, and Patricia Thornwell stepped out, dressed like she was going to a ski resort instead of a disaster zone. "Scott Patterson," she called out, her voice sharp even from 20 feet away. "What in God's name do you think you are doing with that bulldozer?" I straightened up, using a broken beam for support. Patricia was maybe 50, with that particular shade of blonde that comes from expensive salons, and a face that seemed permanently arranged in an expression of disapproval. She was wearing a puffy white jacket that probably cost more than my truck and boots that had never seen a real day's work. "Clearing the road," I said. "My cabin collapsed." "I can see that," she said, picking her way through the snow toward me. "The question is where you got that government vehicle and whether you have permission to be operating it on private property." Private property. That was rich. The roads through Pine Ridge were technically maintained by the HOA, but they were built with county permits and easements. I had as much right to be here as anyone. "I needed to get back up here," I said. "The county is not coming for days." "That does not give you the right to commandeer military equipment," Patricia said. She had reached me now, looking down at the ruins of my cabin with an expression that might have been concern on anyone else but looked more like calculation on her. "This is a serious matter, Scott. I am going to have to report this to the authorities." "You do what you need to do," I said, turning back to my digging. "I am a little busy right now." "I can see that. I can also see that your structure has completely failed. That is a code violation. This debris needs to be cleared within 30 days according to HOA regulations, Section 15, Paragraph 8. I stopped digging, turned to look at her. "My house just collapsed in a blizzard and you are threatening me with HOA fines." "I am not threatening anyone," Patricia said, her voice taking on that particular tone of false reasonableness that always preceded something unreasonable. "I am simply informing you of the regulations. We have standards to maintain in Pine Ridge. This kind of blight affects everyone's property values." Property values. I had just lost everything and she was worried about property values. "Get off my land," I said quietly. "Excuse me?" I said, "Get off my land." Now, Patricia's face flushed red. "How dare you speak to me that way?" "I am the HOA president. I have every right to inspect properties for code compliance. And I have every right to tell you to leave. So leave." For a moment I thought she might actually push it, but something in my expression must have convinced her otherwise. She turned on her designer boots and stalked back to her Escalade, nearly slipping twice in the snow. "You have not heard the last of this," she called back. "That bulldozer is stolen property. Those road repairs were not approved by the HOA. And you have 30 days to clear this mess, or the fines start accumulating. $50 per day, Scott. Think about that." She climbed into her Escalade and spun the tires backing up, spraying snow everywhere before disappearing down the road I had just cleared. I stood there for a long moment, breathing hard, my legs screaming, my hands numb, staring at the ruins of my life. $50 a day. 30 days. That was $1,500 on top of everything else, and I was supposed to clear several tons of debris with what? My bare hands and a bad leg. The sun was setting, turning the snow orange and gold, beautiful and completely indifferent to my problems. I grabbed what I could from the ruins, loaded it into my truck, and climbed back into the bulldozer. I was not done with it yet. If Patricia wanted to play games with regulations and codes, I could play too. I had been playing games with military bureaucracy for years. I knew how these systems worked, and I knew their weaknesses. I spent the next 2 days living in my truck and working with the bulldozer. I cleared the road all the way down to the county highway, a 5-mile stretch that I opened up to 2 full lanes. I cleared the driveways of the other cabins in Pine Ridge, whether the owners were there or not. And then I started clearing something else. The Pine Ridge Estates HOA had assets. Patricia had made sure of that. When she took over, she had pushed through a special assessment to build a community center at the entrance to the development. It was supposed to be a nice facility, a place for residents to gather, have meetings, maybe host some events. What it actually was Patricia's personal kingdom, a 1,500-square-foot building with her name on a plaque by the door and her office taking up half the space. The building was buried under snow, just like everything else. You could barely see it, just a vague lump with a chimney sticking out. I parked the bulldozer in front of it around noon on the 3rd day. The sun was out again, bright and cold. I sat there for a while, thinking about what I was about to do. This was going to escalate things. This was going to bring consequences. But I was so tired of being pushed around. Tired of bureaucracies and regulations and people like Patricia who treated people like me as problems to be managed rather than human beings who had sacrificed and bled for their country. The VA had denied my claim. Patricia was threatening me with fines I could not pay, and I was sitting in a stolen bulldozer with nothing left to lose. I lowered the blade and pushed forward. The snow in front of the community center was deep, compressed into dense drifts that had frozen solid. The bulldozer dug in and shoved, and the whole mass started moving. I could see the front of the building now, the glass doors and windows dark behind the white. I kept pushing. The blade hit the building with a crunch of metal and concrete. The windows shattered. The door frame buckled. I reversed, raised the blade, and hit it again. This was stupid. This was probably illegal. This was definitely going to get me arrested. I hit it a 3rd time and part of the front wall collapsed inward. Insulation and drywall spilled out into the snow like guts from a wound. I was about to make a 4th pass when I saw the Escalade coming up the road, moving fast. Patricia had probably seen me from wherever she lived down in the valley, or someone had called her. Either way, she was coming, and she was not alone. I could see lights behind her, blue and red, flashing. I shut off the bulldozer and climbed down. My leg nearly gave out and I had to catch myself on the tracks. Everything hurt. I was exhausted, cold, and probably about to go to jail. The Escalade skidded to a stop 20 feet away, and Patricia practically fell out of it, her face purple with rage. Behind her, a Summit County Sheriff's SUV pulled up and 2 deputies got out, hands near their weapons. "That is him," Patricia was screaming, pointing at me like I was some kind of criminal. "He destroyed the community center. He stole government property. Arrest him." The deputies approached carefully. They were both young, probably mid-20s, and they looked uncertain. One of them, a tall guy with a name tag that said Rodriguez, held up a hand. "Sir, are you Scott Patterson?" "I am," I said. "Sir, we have received reports that you are operating a military vehicle without authorization and that you have just committed vandalism against HOA property. Is that true?" I looked past him at the community center. The front wall was partially collapsed, snow and debris everywhere. It looked bad. It was bad. "The bulldozer is from the National Guard depot off Fire Road 12, I said. "I used it to clear the roads after the blizzard because the county was not responding. As for the building, yeah, I hit it multiple times, intentionally." "Oh my God," Patricia said. She looked like she might actually have a stroke. "He is confessing. You heard him confess. Arrest him right now." Rodriguez exchanged a glance with his partner, a shorter woman named Chen according to her tag. "Sir, I need you to put your hands behind your back." I did not resist. What would be the point? They cuffed me, read me my rights, the whole routine. Patricia was still screaming in the background about damages and lawsuits and criminal charges. The deputies loaded me into the back of their SUV, and we started the drive down the mountain. I spent that night in the Summit County Jail, which was less jail and more holding facility attached to the sheriff's department in Breckenridge. The cell was clean and warm, which was more than I could say for my truck. They fed me, gave me a blanket, and left me alone. I had a bail hearing the next morning. The charges were theft of government property and criminal mischief, both felonies. The prosecutor, a tired-looking woman in her 40s, laid it out pretty clearly. If convicted, I was looking at serious prison time. The judge was an older man named Hartley who looked like he had seen everything and was not impressed by any of it. He read through the charges, looked at me standing there in an orange jumpsuit, and sighed. "Mr. Patterson, do you have legal representation?" "No, Your Honor." "Can you afford legal representation?" "No, Your Honor," he sighed again. "The court will appoint a public defender. Bail is set at $25,000. Next case." I could not afford $25,000. I could not afford $25 at this point. So I went back to my cell and waited. The public defender showed up 2 days later. Her name was Jennifer Martinez, and she looked like she was juggling about 500 cases at once. We talked for 30 minutes in a conference room with a two-way mirror. "Okay," she said, shuffling through papers. "Let's talk about your situation. The theft charge is problematic because you did technically take government property without authorization. The criminal mischief charge is based on damages to the HOA building, which the HOA president is claiming will cost upwards of $50,000 to repair." "50,000, I said. "The whole building is not worth $50,000. It is a prefab metal building with cheap finishes. I maybe did $10,000 in damage tops." "That is something we can argue, but Scott, I have to be honest with you. This case does not look great. The prosecution has you on video, they have your confession to the deputies, and they have the HOA president who is apparently very motivated to see you prosecuted to the fullest extent. What are my options?" Jennifer leaned back in her chair. "Best case scenario, we negotiate a plea deal. You plead guilty to reduce charges, do some jail time, pay restitution, probation. Worst case, we go to trial, you get convicted on all counts, and you are looking at 5 to 10 years in state prison. 5 to 10 years. For clearing roads and hitting a building with a bulldozer." "There has to be another option," I said. "There might be," Jennifer said slowly. "Tell me about your situation with the VA. Tell me about your cabin, the blizzard, everything. From the beginning." So I did. I told her about the rejection letter, about the cabin collapsing, about being stranded on the mountain with no help coming. I told her about Patricia and the HOA and the threatened fines. I told her about feeling like I was drowning in bureaucracy and regulations while the people who were supposed to help me just kept piling on more. Jennifer took notes, asked questions, and by the end of our conversation, she was nodding slowly. "Okay," she said. "Okay, I think we might have something here. Let me do some research. I am going to file for a continuance, get you out on and we are going to build a defense." "What kind of defense?" She looked at me seriously. "The truth. Sometimes that actually works." I got released on my own recognizance 3 days later. No bail, just a promise to appear for trial and not to leave the county. I walked out of the jail into bright sunshine and cold air, with nowhere to go and nothing to my name except the clothes I was wearing and the contents of my emergency pack. My truck was still up at Pine Ridge, buried in snow. The bulldozer had been recovered by very angry National Guard personnel. My cabin was still a pile of rubble, and I was facing felony charges. I needed to regroup. I needed a place to stay. I needed to figure out what the hell I was going to do with my life. I started walking down Main Street, past all the expensive ski shops and tourist restaurants. Breckenridge was a beautiful town, picturesque and wealthy, exactly the kind of place that had no room for people like me. Everything was expensive, everyone was moving with purpose, and I was just a broke veteran with a limp and a criminal record. I ended up at the library, which was warm and free. I sat at one of the computers and started doing research. I looked up HOA laws in Colorado, veterans benefits regulations, and criminal defense strategies. The more I read, the more angry I got. Colorado had some of the strictest HOA laws in the country, but they also had protections for homeowners. HOAs could not just fine people arbitrarily. They had to follow their own rules, provide proper notice, and allow for appeals. I started pulling up the Pine Ridge HOA bylaws, which were public record, and I found some interesting things. The special assessment Patricia had pushed through to build the community center had been voted on at a meeting where only 5 of the 20 property owners were present. According to the bylaws, special assessments required a majority vote of all owners, not just those present. The assessment was invalid, which meant the building I had damaged might not actually be legitimate HOA property. I kept digging. The more I looked, the more problems I found with how Patricia had been running things. Unapproved contracts, questionable expenses, meetings held without proper notice. It was a mess, and it was all documented in meeting minutes and financial reports that she had been required to file with the county. I spent 6 hours in that library, taking notes, printing documents. By the time I left, I had a folder full of evidence that Patricia Thornwell had been running the Pine Ridge HOA like her personal fiefdom, and she had been doing it illegally. I found Jennifer at her office the next day, which was a cramped space in an old building downtown that she shared with 3 other public defenders. I showed her what I had found. She looked through the documents, her expression growing more interested with each page. "This is good," she said finally. "This is really good. If the community center was built with funds from an invalid assessment, then it might not legally be HOA property, which would complicate the criminal mischief charge significantly. Can we use this?" "Absolutely." "And Scott, there is something else. I have been looking into the bulldozer situation. That National Guard depot has been essentially abandoned for 3 years. There is no regular security, no active inventory management. The equipment there has been written off as surplus in most of the Pentagon's records. The theft charge assumes you stole active military property, but if the property has been legally abandoned or designated as surplus, that charge gets much weaker. So what are you saying?" "I am saying we might actually have a chance to beat this. I am saying that if we can show you were in an emergency situation, acting out of necessity to clear roads and access your property, and if we can show that the HOA was acting improperly, we can create enough reasonable doubt to make the prosecution's case fall apart." I felt something unfamiliar stirring in my chest. It took me a moment to recognize it as hope. "What do we need to do?" "First, we need to gather more evidence. I need you to document everything about your cabin, the blizzard, the county's failure to respond. Pictures, weather reports, anything that shows how desperate the situation was. Second, we need to challenge the HOA's standing in this case. If they do not legally own that building, they cannot claim damages. And third, we need to make some noise about how veterans are being treated by the systems that are supposed to help them." "Noise," Jennifer gave me a small smile. I know some reporters. This kind of story, veteran denied benefits, loses his home, gets arrested for trying to help himself. That is exactly the kind of thing that gets attention, and attention creates pressure. We spent the next week building the case. I went back up to Pine Ridge, escorted by a deputy who had been assigned to make sure I did not do anything else destructive, and documented everything. I took hundreds of photos of the collapsed cabin, the snow damage, the roads that would have been impassable without the bulldozer. I collected the VA rejection letter, my medical records, my service records, everything that told the story of who I was and what I had been through. Jennifer reached out to a reporter from the Denver Post named Sarah Kim, who specialized in veterans issues. Sarah came up to Breckenridge and interviewed me for 3 hours, asking questions about everything from my military service to my current legal situation. She was sharp and sympathetic, and I could tell she understood what this story meant. The article ran on a Sunday front page of the local section, with a headline that read, "Veteran faces felony charges after using bulldozer to clear snow." It laid out the whole situation: the denied benefits, the collapsed cabin, the HOA threats, the desperate decision to take the bulldozer. Sarah had done her homework too, interviewing other residents of Pine Ridge who talked about Patricia's heavy-handed management style and questionable decisions. The response was immediate and overwhelming. By Monday morning, the article had been picked up by the Associated Press and was running in newspapers across the country. By Monday afternoon, it was on cable news. By Tuesday, my story was everywhere, and public opinion had very clearly decided I was not the villain. The pressure started building on the prosecution. The district attorney's office started getting calls, emails, letters. Veterans groups got involved. A lawyer from the HOA contacted Jennifer and offered to help with the case. Suddenly, what had seemed like a straightforward prosecution of a property crime was turning into a political nightmare. The HOA was getting pressure too. Other property owners in Pine Ridge, many of whom had been quietly unhappy with Patricia's management, started speaking up. Someone filed a formal complaint with the county about the special assessment. Someone else demanded a full financial audit. Patricia tried to hold an emergency meeting to address the concerns, but it turned into a revolt, with owners demanding her resignation. Through all of this, I was staying in a cheap motel on the outskirts of Breckenridge, the kind of place that rented by the week and did not ask too many questions. I spent my days helping Jennifer prepare for trial, and my nights lying awake wondering if any of this would actually work, or if I was just delaying the inevitable trip to prison. The trial was scheduled for late March, about 2 months after I had been arrested. In the weeks leading up to it, Jennifer filed motion after motion. She challenged the validity of the criminal mischief charge based on questions about the HOA's ownership of the community center. She challenged the theft charge based on the status of the National Guard depot and the bulldozer. She filed motions to suppress evidence, motions to dismiss, motions to do everything possible to put the prosecution on its heels. Most of the motions were denied, but a few stuck. The judge ruled that the question of the HOA's legal ownership of the community center was relevant and would be allowed as part of the defense. That was huge. It meant we could put Patricia on the stand and question her about how the HOA was being run. The prosecution, sensing that their case was not as solid as they had thought, offered a plea deal: plead guilty to a misdemeanor, pay $5,000 in restitution, 2 years probation. Jennifer brought it to me in a conference room at the courthouse. "It is not a bad deal," she said. "You avoid prison, the felonies go away, and you can start rebuilding your life." "What about the HOA?" I asked. "What about Patricia and all the illegal stuff she has been doing?" That would be separate. The property owners would have to pursue it themselves. It is not part of this case. I thought about it. $5,000 I did not have, 2 years of probation, and Patricia would walk away probably to do the same thing to someone else. No, I said. I want to go to trial. Jennifer nodded slowly. Okay, then we go to trial. The trial started on a cold Monday morning in late March. The snow had finally melted in the valleys, though the peaks were still white. The courthouse in Breckenridge was a modern building with too much glass and not enough character. I sat at the defense table in a suit Jennifer had helped me borrow from a charitable organization, watching as the jury was selected. They were a mixed group, 8 women and 4 men, ranging from a 20-something ski instructor to a retired accountant. Jennifer had explained her strategy. We wanted people who would be sympathetic to a veteran, skeptical of authority, and willing to consider that sometimes breaking the rules is justified. The prosecution's opening statement was straightforward. I had stolen government property. I had destroyed HOA property. I had confessed to both crimes. The evidence was clear and the law was clear. I was guilty and I should be punished. Jennifer's opening was different. She told my story from my service in Afghanistan to my medical discharge to my struggle to build a life in Colorado. She talked about the VA's denial of benefits, about the blizzard that destroyed my cabin, about being trapped on a mountain with no help coming. She talked about the HOA's harassment and illegal assessments, and she talked about what any reasonable person would have done in my situation. This is not a case about theft or vandalism, she told the jury. This is a case about a man who did what he had to do to survive, and it is about a system that failed him at every turn. The prosecution's case took 2 days. They brought in a National Guard officer who testified that the Bulldozer was government property and that I had no authorization to use it. They brought in a contractor who estimated the damage to the community center at $42,000. They brought in Deputy Rodriguez, who testified about my confession. Jennifer's cross-examinations were surgical. She got the National Guard officer to admit that the depot had no active security and that the Bulldozer had not been used or inventoried in over 2 years. She got the contractor to admit that his estimate was for a complete rebuild to higher standards than the original construction. She got Rodriguez to acknowledge that I had been cooperative and had explained that I was in an emergency situation. Then it was our turn. Jennifer called me to the stand first. I was nervous, my hands shaking slightly as I was sworn in, but once I started talking, it got easier. I told my story, all of it, holding nothing back. I talked about the pain of my injuries, the frustration of dealing with the VA, the terror of watching my cabin collapse. I talked about sitting in my truck in sub-zero temperatures, knowing that if I did not do something, I might die on that mountain. The prosecutor's cross-examination was aggressive. He tried to paint me as someone who had a history of disregarding authority, who had taken what he wanted without caring about the consequences. But Jennifer had prepared me well. I stayed calm, answered truthfully, and made it clear that I had not wanted to break any laws but had seen no other option. The key moment came when Jennifer called Patricia to the stand. Patricia clearly did not want to be there. She was wearing a conservative business suit and a tight expression, and she looked at me with pure hatred as she was sworn in. Jennifer started gently, asking about the HOA, its formation, its purpose. Patricia relaxed slightly, probably thinking this was going to be easy. Then Jennifer shifted gears. Mrs. Thornwell, let's talk about the special assessment that funded the community center. Can you tell the jury how that vote was conducted? We held a meeting and the property owners voted to approve it, Patricia said. How many property owners were present at that meeting? I do not recall exactly. Jennifer pulled out a document. According to the meeting minutes that you signed, there were 5 property owners present. Is that correct? If that is what the minutes say, then yes. And how many total property owners are there in Pine Ridge Estates? 20. So 5 out of 20 property owners voted to approve a special assessment of $1,500 per property. Is that correct? Patricia's jaw tightened. The bylaws state that votes are based on those present at a properly noticed meeting. Actually, they do not. Jennifer pulled out another document. Section 7, Paragraph 3 of the Pine Ridge HOA bylaws states that special assessments require approval by a majority of all property owners, not just those present. Would you like to read it? The courtroom was silent. Patricia stared at the document, her face flushing red. I was advised by our HOA attorney that the vote was valid, she said finally. Who is your HOA attorney? Randall Simmons. And Mr. Simmons is also your brother-in-law, is he not? I do not see how that is relevant. Please answer the question. Yes, he is my brother-in-law. Jennifer let that hang in the air for a moment. Let's move on. The community center, which was built with funds from this potentially invalid special assessment, contains an office. Your office, correct? I am the HOA president. I need a space to work. And this office, which takes up approximately half the building, has your name on a plaque outside the door. Yes. And you are the only person with a key to this office. Yes. What do you keep in this office, Mrs. Thornwell? HOA documents, files, records. Anything else? Patricia hesitated. Personal items. Personal items. Like what? I do not see how this is relevant to the defendant's criminal actions. The judge intervened. Please answer the question, Mrs. Thornwell. Patricia looked like she wanted to refuse, but she finally answered. Some personal files. Some items I store there for convenience. Jennifer pulled out her phone and brought up a photo. Your Honor, I would like to enter Defense Exhibit 12 into evidence. Mrs. Thornwell, can you identify what is in this photo? The photo was displayed on a screen for the jury. It showed the interior of Patricia's office in the community center, taken after the damage but before everything had been removed. The office was filled with personal items, file cabinets, a computer, boxes labeled with Patricia's name. That is my office, Patricia said tightly. That office, which you claim is for HOA business, appears to contain a significant amount of personal property, including these boxes here. Jennifer zoomed in on the photo. These boxes are labeled PTW Consulting. What is PTW Consulting, Mrs. Thornwell? Patricia went pale. That is my business, your business. A private consulting business that you have been running out of a building that was supposedly built for community use with community funds. Is that correct? I occasionally did some work there. That does not mean anything. Did the HOA members know you were using the community center for your private business? I do not have to justify my use of HOA facilities to anyone. Actually, you do. You are the president of the HOA, which makes you a fiduciary to the property owners. Using community funds and property for personal benefit is a violation of that fiduciary duty. It is also, depending on the specifics, potentially fraud. The prosecutor objected, arguing that Patricia's business activities were not relevant to my criminal charges. The judge overruled him, noting that the question of who actually owned the community center and whether the HOA had legitimate standing to claim damages was central to the case. Jennifer pressed on, pulling out more evidence of Patricia's mismanagement. Contracts she had signed without board approval, expenses she had charged to the HOA that appeared personal, meetings held without proper notice. By the time Jennifer was done, Patricia looked like she wanted to disappear, and the jury was looking at her with undisguised skepticism. The prosecution tried to rehabilitate her on redirect, but the damage was done. Patricia was not a sympathetic victim. She was someone who had been using her position for personal gain and had gotten caught. The rest of the trial moved quickly. Jennifer called other witnesses who testified about the blizzard conditions, about how desperate the situation had been, about how the county had been overwhelmed and unable to respond. She called a legal expert who testified about the doctrine of necessity, which allows people to break laws in emergency situations when there is no reasonable alternative. In closing arguments, the prosecutor tried to bring it back to the basic facts. I had taken property that was not mine, and I had damaged property that belonged to others. The reasons might be sympathetic, but the law was the law. Jennifer's closing was passionate. She talked about what we ask of veterans, about the sacrifices they make, and the promises we make in return. She talked about systems that fail the people they are supposed to serve, and what happens when those failures become life-threatening. And she talked about the real criminal in this case, which was not me but an HOA president who had been abusing her power for years. Scott Patterson did what he had to do to survive, she told the jury. He cleared roads that no one else was going to clear. He saved himself when no one else would. And yes, in the process, he damaged a building that should never have been built in the first place, that was being used illegally by someone who saw the HOA as her personal kingdom. If that is a crime, then we need to take a hard look at what we consider criminal in this country. The jury deliberated for 7 hours. I spent that time in a conference room with Jennifer, trying not to think about what would happen if they came back with guilty verdicts, trying not to think about prison, about losing what little I had left. Finally, the bailiff came and told us the jury was back. We filed into the courtroom. The jury looked tired but resolute. The judge asked if they had reached a verdict, and the foreperson, the retired accountant, stood up. "We have, Your Honor." "On the count of theft of government property, how do you find not guilty?" I felt Jennifer's hand grip my arm. I could not breathe. "On the count of criminal mischief, how do you find not guilty?" The courtroom erupted. The judge banged his gavel, calling for order. I just stood there, not quite believing what I had heard. Not guilty. On both counts. Patricia stormed out of the courtroom, her face twisted with rage. The prosecutor looked disappointed but not surprised. The judge thanked the jury for their service and dismissed them. I was free. Jennifer hugged me, something defense attorneys probably are not supposed to do, but neither of us cared. "You did it," she said. "We did it." Outside the courthouse, Sarah Kim from the Denver Post was waiting with a camera crew. "Mr. Patterson, how do you feel about the verdict?" "Relieved," I said. "Grateful. Ready to move on with my life." "What are your plans now?" That was a good question. I had no home, no job, and not much money. But I had something I had not had in a long time, a clean slate. "I am going to rebuild," I said. "That is what you do. You get knocked down, and you rebuild." The aftermath of the trial moved quickly. The story of my acquittal was picked up nationally, and suddenly I was getting calls from veterans organizations, legal advocates, even a few politicians who wanted to talk about reforming the VA benefits system. I did a few interviews, told my story, tried to help shine a light on the problems that so many veterans face. The Pine Ridge HOA imploded. Once the questions about Patricia's management became public, property owners demanded a full investigation. They hired an independent auditor who found that Patricia had been using HOA funds inappropriately for years, routing money through her consulting business, paying herself for services that were never properly authorized. The total amount was over $60,000. The property owners voted unanimously to remove Patricia as president and filed a civil suit against her for the missing funds. She tried to fight it, but the evidence was overwhelming. She ended up settling, agreeing to pay back the money and resign from the HOA permanently. But that was not the end of it. The county district attorney's office, embarrassed by how the criminal case against me had gone and under pressure from the publicity, opened an investigation into Patricia's conduct. They looked at the same evidence the auditors had found and reached a conclusion. Patricia had committed fraud, embezzlement, and abuse of her position as a fiduciary. She was arrested in late April, charged with multiple felonies related to her HOA activities. I found out about it from Sarah Kim, who called me for a comment. I did not have much to say. I felt no satisfaction in Patricia's downfall, just a kind of tired relief that maybe justice was actually happening. As for me, I was dealing with my own rebuilding. The National Guard, probably eager to avoid any more bad publicity, decided not to pursue any disciplinary action related to the Bulldozer. They quietly updated their security at the depot and wrote the whole thing off as a learning experience. The VA, also feeling pressure from the media coverage, reopened my benefits claim. This time, with Jennifer's help and with the attention of veterans advocacy groups, the process moved much faster. By June, I had been approved for housing assistance and disability benefits that were substantially more than what I had been receiving. It was enough to start over. I went back up to Pine Ridge in early summer, after the snow had fully melted and the weather had turned warm. My property was still there, a cleared lot with some debris remaining but mostly just empty space where my cabin had been. Other property owners came by while I was there. They apologized for Patricia, for the way the HOA had been run, for not speaking up sooner. They voted to dissolve the special assessment and return the fees that had been collected. They voted to tear down what was left of the community center and return the land to open space. I stood on my property, looking at the mountains and the pine trees and the clear blue sky, and I made a decision. I was going to rebuild the cabin, but better this time, stronger, up to code and then some. I was going to stay in this place that had tried to break me because I was not going to let it win. Construction started in July. I hired local contractors, guys who knew mountain building and who did solid work. I was there every day, doing what I could with my bad leg, learning new skills, being part of the process. The cabin rose slowly, frame and roof and walls, taking shape like a promise being kept. By October it was done. A new cabin, better insulated, better built, with a standing seam metal roof that could handle any amount of snow. I moved in on a crisp fall day, carrying boxes of my salvaged possessions and new things I had bought with my back benefits. That first night, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sun set over the mountains. My leg ached like it always did, but it was a familiar ache, something I had learned to live with. The air was cold and clean, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear elk bugling their evening calls. I thought about everything that had happened, all the mistakes and disasters and unlikely victories. I thought about the Bulldozer, about Patricia and the trial, about Jennifer and Sarah, and all the people who had helped me when I needed it most. Mostly, though, I thought about what comes next. Building a life is not a one-time thing. It is something you do every day, making choices, taking chances, refusing to give up even when everything seems impossible. The HOA was gone, dissolved by mutual agreement of the remaining property owners who decided they could manage their own affairs without someone like Patricia telling them what to do. The community center was torn down, the land returned to nature. The special assessment fees were refunded, and people went back to their lives, a little wiser and a lot more careful about who they trusted with authority. I got a job working part-time for a local construction company, doing project management and estimating. It was not glamorous, but it paid decent, and I was good at it. My VA benefits covered the basics, and between the two income sources, I was actually financially stable for the first time in years. Jennifer and I stayed in touch. She had gone on to handle other cases, always fighting for people who needed someone in their corner. She stopped by the cabin one day in November, bringing a bottle of wine and congratulations on the new place. "You did good," she said, standing on the porch and looking at the view. "This is really beautiful." "Thanks for everything," I said. "I mean it. You saved my life." "You saved your own life," she said. "I just helped with the legal paperwork. What you did, clearing those roads, standing up to the HOA, telling your story, that was all you." We drank the wine and talked about her other cases, about the justice system and its flaws, about how change happens slowly, but it does happen. When she left, she hugged me again and told me to stay out of trouble. "I will do my best," I said. Winter came again, but this time I was ready. The cabin was warm and solid. I had plenty of food, plenty of firewood, and a reliable truck with good snow tires. When the first big storm hit in December, dropping 3 feet overnight, I just sat inside by the fire and listened to the wind howl, completely at peace. The Bulldozer incident, as people started calling it, had become something of a legend in Summit County. People I did not know would recognize me sometimes, tell me they had followed the story, thank me for standing up to the HOA. It was embarrassing and gratifying in equal measure. Sarah Kim won an award for her reporting on the case. She wrote a follow-up piece in March, 1 year after the trial, checking in on how I was doing and what had changed in the community. It was a good article, thoughtful and fair, talking about the broader issues of veterans' benefits and HOA overreach while keeping the focus human and personal. By the second spring in my new cabin, life had settled into something resembling normal. I worked. I hiked when my leg allowed it. I read books and watched the seasons change. I stayed in touch with a few other veterans I had met through advocacy groups, guys and women dealing with their own struggles with the VA and civilian life. We helped each other when we could, shared information, provided support. The property values in Pine Ridge actually went up after Patricia left, and the HOA was dissolved. Turns out people liked living in a place where they did not have to deal with arbitrary rules and power-hungry board members. A few new families moved in, younger folks with kids, and the area took on a different character, more relaxed and neighborly. I never got an apology from the VA for denying my initial claim. Bureaucracies do not apologize. But I did get a letter from a VA administrator acknowledging that my case had led to some policy reviews and changes in how claims were processed. Small victories, but victories nonetheless. As for Patricia, she pleaded guilty to embezzlement and fraud charges in a deal that kept her out of prison, but required her to pay back everything she had taken plus penalties. She moved away from Summit County, and I heard she relocated somewhere in Texas. I hoped she learned something from the experience, but I was not holding my breath. The National Guard depot where I had taken the Bulldozer was officially closed, and the equipment moved to active facilities. Someone probably wrote a report about security failures and lessons learned. The Army is good at reports. I thought sometimes about that moment in the blizzard, sitting in my truck watching my cabin collapse, holding that VA rejection letter. I thought about how desperate I had been, how close to giving up. And I thought about the decision to take that Bulldozer, to clear those roads, to do something even though it was probably illegal and definitely risky. Would I do it again? Probably not. There were better ways to handle the situation, smarter ways. But in that moment, with the information I had and the options available, I did what seemed necessary. And somehow, impossibly, it had worked out. Life is strange that way. You make choices, you face consequences, and sometimes, if you are lucky and you have good people in your corner, you get a second chance. I got my second chance. I got my home back, my stability, my sense of purpose. I got to be part of something larger than myself when my story helped change some policies and shine a light on problems that needed addressing. On quiet mornings, I would sit on my porch with coffee and watch the sun come up over the mountains. The same mountains that had nearly killed me, that had tested me and broken me and ultimately forced me to become stronger. I was grateful for them in a way I had not expected. They had given me something to push against, something to overcome. The cabin stood solid and strong, my sanctuary and my achievement. Every board and nail represented a choice to keep going, to not give up, to build something lasting from the ruins of what had been lost. The veterans' advocacy work continued. I spoke at a few events, shared my story when asked, tried to help other guys navigate the VA system that had given me so much trouble. It felt good to take my experience, as painful as it had been, and use it to help others. That was something the Army had taught me. You do not leave people behind, and when you can help, you help. Years from now, I figured people might still talk about the Bulldozer incident. It would be a story told in local bars, maybe embellished a bit with each retelling. The veteran who stole a tank, some would say, even though it was a bulldozer, not a tank. The guy who went to war with the HOA and won. The story would probably get the details wrong, but that was okay. The truth was in the court records and the newspaper articles for anyone who really wanted to know it. What mattered to me was not the story but the reality I had built from it. This cabin, this life, this sense of having fought for something and won. Not because I was special or heroic, but because I had been pushed to a limit and refused to break. The blizzard had destroyed my cabin, but it had not destroyed me. The VA had denied my benefits, but eventually the system had worked. The HOA had tried to bury me in fines and regulations, but justice had prevailed. And the bulldozer, that old beaten-up piece of military surplus, had been exactly what I needed at exactly the right time. I kept a photo on my wall, one that Sarah had taken during the trial. It showed me standing outside the courthouse after the verdict, Jennifer beside me, both of us smiling despite the exhaustion. I looked at it sometimes when things were hard, when my leg hurt too much, or when I got another confusing letter from some government agency. It reminded me that I had faced worse and survived. The mountains outside my window were still there, unchanging and eternal. Snow would come again, storms would rage, and life would continue to throw challenges my way. But I was ready for them now. I had a home that could withstand the weather, resources to fall back on, and the knowledge that when pushed to the edge, I could find a way through. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything. As the sun set on another day in Summit County, I finished my coffee and went inside. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges and opportunities. Tonight, I was home. I was safe, and I was free. After everything I had been through, that was more than I had once thought possible. The bulldozer was long gone, returned to whatever depot the guard had sent it to. But the roads I had cleared remained, maintained now by the county and used every day by the people who lived up here in the mountains. In a way, that felt like the most lasting contribution. Not the drama or the trial or the headlines, but the simple fact that I had cleared a path when one was needed and people were still using it. That was good enough for me. Some people build monuments. I had just built a road and a cabin. But they were mine, earned through sweat and risk and refusal to quit. And in the end, that made all the difference.